Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. This is a podcast detailing around 10 years of ethnographic research into autistic Christians and ex-Christians. This podcast takes a look at the data that I've collected from over 26,000 autistic Christians, interviews with over 600 now at this point, autistic Christians and ex-Christians, and many conversations, surveys, and other things, just gathering data about what autistic Christians and ex-Christians look like. And one question I often get asked is, do you have a favorite group of autistic Christians or ex-Christians? And I give the classic parent answer that I love all of you equally, but that isn't true. In reality, I do have a favorite group, and my favorite group are the autistic Christian radfems. I find them fascinating, and I think they are by far the most interesting group of autistics that are out there. People ask me why am I so fascinated with this group? If you can't tell by my voice, it's very obvious I'm a man. If you hear about my background, I'm former military intelligence. I work in cybersecurity. I do powerlifting. Not the type of person you would expect to be interested in radfems, but nevertheless, I am. And one of the big reasons is I interview a lot of autistic women. And it's very interesting because as a man or as a woman, I guess everyone wonders, what would my life have been like if I were the other gender? And I specifically look at autistic Christians, being an autistic Christian myself, and I always find one group of autistic Christians who are I'm like, oh, that's what John would be if I was a woman instead of a man. And every single time I meet one of those, she's a rad femme. And then another thing is, a point in my life, I worked in counter trafficking. It was for a brief moment of my career. I was basically seconded to work counter trafficking, and that brought up a lot of questions for me, a lot of questions that I had not previously considered, and it made me confront a lot of issues that I wasn't previously ready or willing to confront, a lot based on gender-based violence and things like that. That was basically an uncomfortable topic that I had the luxury of ignoring, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. And I was asking some of the women I was working with, how do you deal with this? How do you wrap your head around it? And they're like, have you heard of Andrea Dworkin? And they got me reading the radfem online library and reading Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon. And I basically came away with the analysis. I'm like, okay, some of these things that they're saying are out there. Dworkin has said some weird stuff, but overall, the overall thrust is they're just right. They're just correct in their analysis. I'm working in counter trafficking, and then I'm reading Dworkin, and she's just perfectly describing what's going on. Or I'm reading McKinnon, and she is perfectly describing what's going on. I'm like, this has to be for a reason, and that reason is probably because they're just at some level correct. And ever since then, I've just been fascinated with this group of basically people who are very close to me, but the opposite gender, all being radfems, and then me coming to the conclusion that the radfems are probably right about a lot of stuff, at least when they're talking about trafficking and counter trafficking and sexual violence against women. And so I find this group fascinating. If you follow me on Twitter, you will know I tweet about them a lot. And most of my close friends online are radfems. Anyway, this is my favorite group, and we're going to talk about them. People have been asking me to do a deep dive on them, and so we're doing that. And to help me with that, I have Marie, who is one of these autistic women that I have interviewed that is also a radical feminist. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Marie. I am autistic, ASD1. I'm also a Christian, I'm a Catholic, and I'm also a radical feminist. I was raised in a very conservative sort of household where feminism was actually a dirty word. Became acquainted with feminism in college and sort of in high school and college, and then came to sort of radical feminism just a few years ago. Similarly, through reading Dworkin and McKinnon and Firestone. And I will say, understanding that, yes, there are certainly a few out there things that radical feminists say, but then also just, I would say very similarly, just realizing, wait a second, of all the things that I read in feminism, and this actually seems to map onto reality really well, notwithstanding some of the things which we'll get into this stuff later, but just a few things which seems odd. And also just in terms of reading about like sociology and anthropology and how gender works in like society, etc. Radical feminism seems to map onto reality actually quite well, I found.
So I myself am not a radical feminist. There are a lot of debates within radical feminism about whether men can be radfems, and I really don't care if they can or can't. I wouldn't consider myself a radical feminist. I would consider myself sympathetic to many of their ideas, and so that's where I fall ideologically. I have done a previous episode on autistic attitudes towards feminism, and in that I did talk about radical feminism. We covered many different topics, which we will try not to do again. But just to give you a brief overview of that episode, the basic breakdown is as you expect. Left progressive autistic Christians are more likely to endorse feminism explicitly, and conservative autistic Christians are less likely to explicitly endorse feminism, but do have some overlaps depending on the demographics. Most autistic Christians will endorse the idea. I think that sometimes feminists make good points. And a lot of autistic Christians, while they aren't radical feminists, will find themselves in a radical feminist adjacent camp, or at least appreciative of some forms of radical feminist critique. And a lot of one thing that I've documented is a lot of autistic Christians, especially autistic Christian women raised in more conservative environments, independently derive radical feminist ideas from first principles without realizing it. Just I think I said that it's like through the sheer power of autism and Christian misogyny, they like develop radical feminist principles from first principles. And yeah, the other trend we talked about is there are a lot of crypto turfs and turfs in the autistic Christian woman population specifically. So that is the thing. But yeah, so let's talk about what radical feminism actually is. Do you want to take a stab at that first, or do you want me to try and then you can come in second?
I would say that radical feminism is a class-based analysis. It does have Marxist roots. So this is basically looking at women as a class, and women as a class who are oppressed due to their sexuality or their gender, or as Catherine McKinnon would put it, as it's a system of dominance and control by men that subjugates women. So seeking to liberate women from this oppression that's due to their biology, their gender, the system of dominance. That's what the tenets of, I would say that's the core tenet of radical feminism.
Yeah. So I would basically say radical feminism, like you said, is a class-based analysis of gender, where it, instead of taking the Marxist categories of the bourgeois and the proletariat, it takes the categories of men and women, and it sees the oppression of women as basically grounded, I think, in four main categories, which is they're oppressed along the lines of sex, sexuality, gender, and reproduction. And so it has a particular emphasis on those four categories when it's analyzing gender-based oppression. Another big thing to talk about with radical feminists is they're social constructionists, or at least the second wave of feminism is mostly social constructionists. So they believe that most of these behaviors are not innate to men and women, but are trained into you from a young age and then inculcated and reinforced by culture. And so it's really important to emphasize that when they first started, radical feminists were social constructionists. I think that has started to shift in more modern radical feminists. If you go into more modern radical feminist circles, you will find less emphasis on social constructionism, but there's still quite a bit of it in it.
I would say that blank slateism, a lot of what radical feminism is actually also building off of Simone de Beauvoir and The Second Sex, which is something which a lot of them are reading, like to read, I would say to read a lot of radical feminism, you'd have to read in conversation with her. And de Beauvoir is very much a blank slatist. So a lot of second wave feminists are also blank slatists. However, this is not like the nature versus nurture debate within radical feminism. This is something that like Catherine McKinnon wanted to transcend, which is what she did with her sort of dominance theory. I do think that she had, even though there are many disagreements with that as well, even within radical feminism, I do think that she had a good idea that we've been fighting about nature versus nurture for so long. Why don't we just focus on the aspects which we pretty much know are socially constructed, or even a lot? And basically, I think that what radical feminists find is that social construction is actually just really everywhere and is just such a big part of like human kind of like life. But that's not necessarily to mean that like to be a radical feminist is to be a blank slatist. So I wouldn't maybe draw that category so
Yeah.
starkly.
Yeah, but if you read radical feminist literature, most of what they're trying to deal with is the societal structures that build and perpetuate ideas of patriarchy and male supremacy. And so
Exactly.
when you encounter them, even though a lot of them are blank slatists, it isn't necessary that you hold to a blank slatist position, but it is
Oh,
necessary that you take seriously that there are a lot of socially constructed elements about gender and gender performance, and those socially constructed elements oppress women more specifically.
yes.
And the
Yes.
goal of feminism isn't like equality, it's liberation from that oppression.
Yes, I would say that's exactly right. The only reason I was commenting was just I think that like some people can confuse the like the socialization and the fact how this can be oppressive to women with believing in like pure blank slatism, which isn't necessarily one does not necessarily
Yeah.
endorse the other. Exactly. But I think the way you formulated it is very representative of what radical feminists believe.
And I think the biggest sort of difference between like radical feminists versus a more intersectional feminist or a liberal feminist is that radical feminists, the goal is liberation. And the goal is liberation from these oppressive structures that are built and defined by society. And so,
Yeah.
is it fighting for equal rights? Sure, if that leads to liberation, but rights in and of themselves will not liberate you from these things. They might be a good first step in the right direction, but this is not the end goal. The end goal is to dismantle these forces that oppress women. Yeah, central thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir, I think, is the central figure in most of radical feminism. Like you said, pretty much everyone is somewhere, somewhat in conversation with her. And in autistic Christian women, though, I find two that are the most common, which is Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon. Those are like the two that I hear cited most when I talk to autistic Christian women and they call themselves radfems. I go, "Oh, who are you most influenced by?" Dworkin and McKinnon come up pretty much every time. There are many other radical feminist thinkers, but when you're looking at this specific cohort, those are the two that if you want to understand, you should be reading. So another really big thing to point out is within radical feminism, a lot of people, because of debates that have popped up in the last 10 years, to be fair, they've been going on since the inception of radical feminism, but especially prominently, people hear the word TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminist, and think that radical feminism is, by its very nature, trans exclusionary. That is not necessarily true. There are two camps, really. Unfortunately, they both sound exactly the same when you try to pronounce them. So you have TIRF and TERF, so trans inclusive and exclusive radical feminists. And this is basically a split over the question, is gender something that can be changed or something that is mutable, or is it unchangeable and immutable? And that's where the split goes. And so the ideological split goes very deeply. This does lead to some interesting debates though, that I've seen, especially because we just talked about how the consensus in radical feminism is that men themselves cannot be radical feminists, because to be a radical feminist is to be interested in the liberation of women from men. And so as a man, you can be interested in helping, but you can't really be doing that. Like it's like that hot dog meme from oh, what's it called? I Think You Should Leave,
Oh
the
yeah.
TV show where the guy's in like the hot dog car, crashes through the building, comes out in a hot dog suit, and he's like, "We're trying to figure out who did this."
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
like, "Okay, yeah, if you're a man in radical feminism, you're the guy in the hot dog suit, so maybe just calm down for a bit." But yeah, that this does lead to interesting debates because there are people who are like, can trans men be radical feminists? And then yeah, that leads to interesting debates between the TIRFs and the TERFs. because the inclusive ones will often say no because they're men, and the exclusive ones will say yes because they're women, which leads to some interesting things. But yeah, being a radical feminist doesn't mean that you are trans exclusionary. There are ways of being a radical feminist and being trans inclusionary. The exclusives will say that's incoherent, you can't do that. The inclusives will say, no, you're incoherent and don't understand. Whatever. This is a whole debate. Just understand that it happens and that there is a split in the community and in the way that they talk about it. So, have you yourself, Marie, noticed a large amount of autism within radfem circles?
I generally, just as a rule, I don't try to like. I mean, in terms of what I suspect online, yeah, absolutely. That's
Yeah.
absolutely true. I generally try not to be like, oh, this person's autistic, unless
Yeah, yeah.
they've come out, I
Just
guess. But
vibes.
but yeah, exactly. I will say there are a lot of autistic vibes in the online radfem community.
People ask me this question all the time, and everyone wants to know like what the answer is, and I always have to tell them, this is actually complicated and it's really hard to track. The sort of TLDR is, yeah, it is definitely overrepresented in this population, but how much it's overrepresented is very hard to tell. And it's also very hard to tell because you look at who is the most likely to be posting large rants online about radical feminism. If you have a normal, well-adjusted radfem and an autistic radfem, who's the one going to be doing the posting? It's probably going to be the autistic one. So you have like selection bias effects and things like that. And the fact that a lot of autistic women are just far more confrontational and far more likely to be the ones aggressive and in your face for various reasons. And so people notice them a lot more. Autistic women are somewhere between 1 to 1.5% of the general population. On the online radfem communities that I have been able to find by just going off people who say they're autistic, it's somewhere between 9 and 14% of the online communities. If anything, that feels low to me. But yeah, somewhere between 9 and 14% is the closest numbers I could find and guess and project. I'm not sure how many actually pan out into IRL groups though. Like I don't know. I've asked a lot of radfem autistic women who are involved in radfem groups, and they usually estimate somewhere between 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 women in their radfem circles are autistic. This is likely an overestimation, though. So, autistic people have a tendency to see autism everywhere, even if it's not there, or to be like, wow, I really like you. Are you autistic? Or just assume that people who they like also have autism because they have autism. And so, take that number with a grain of salt. Autistic people have a really good true positive radar for autism, but often have a very bad false positive radar. So that will tend to lead them to overestimating rather than underestimating. It is quite funny. I did interview an autistic woman about a month ago who's in her 60s or 70s who was heavily involved in radical feminist movements when she was in college. And she only realized she was autistic when her grandchild got diagnosed, and she was one of those grandmas being like, that's not autism, that's exactly how I was when I was a child. And they're like, grandma, you might want to consider. And anyway, so she's also a Christian, and she found me and she wanted to talk, and so we talked. And yeah, I asked her, like, thinking back to your college days or your organizing days or your radfem days, do you think any of your other fellow radfems were autistic now that you like have this knowledge and this background site back in like the glory days of the 70s, 80s, 90s of radical feminism? And she sort of laughed and said, all of them? do I think any of them did? It would be easier to say the ones that I think didn't. And so this is, I don't know exactly how many are. I don't know what the exact percentages are, but the impression that I get from talking to many of these people is that it's certainly overrepresented in these groups. And the impression that I get from doing actual data analysis online is that it is overrepresented within, like, autistic people make up a much larger portion of them. So are autistic Christians more likely to be radfem? Like, if you add in the Christianity, does that change anything? And I covered this in previous episodes, but just in case you haven't listened to that one, the answer is The vast majority are, if you are Christian, you're not explicitly a radfem. Vast majority. Around 5% of the sort of left progressive liberal autistic Christian women that I talk to will say, yeah, I'm a radical feminist, like a full-blown radfem. Not like, sympathetic to them. Around 5% of them will explicitly identify as radical feminist. And the reason it's only 5%, it would be much higher, is because radical feminists have a lot to say about abortion, marriage, and family. And those are things that autistic Christian women tend to care a lot about and will have disagreements with radfems on. And so many of them won't be full-blown radfems, but they'll be in the sort of adjacent category. But of the ones who are like, no, I am a radfem, I own this, it's around 5% of left liberal progressive autistic Christian women that I've been able to find. So if you find a left progressive liberal autistic Christian woman, there is a 5% chance that she is autistic, or 1 in 20. 1 in 20 of them will be a radfem. So that's sort of how it breaks down. Interestingly enough, the sort of radfem adjacent or radfem interested autistic Christian women tend to be pretty common amongst conservative autistic Christian women. Like, the amount of autistic Christian women who I've read who are like, Dworkin does make a lot of really good points, happens far more with more conservative autistic Christian women than it does with the super progressive ones. The super progressive ones tend to be more like intersectional feminism pilled. And while you can be a intersectional radfem, just so happens that more conservative autistic Christian women will be more likely to explicitly identify with liking the ideas of radical feminism as opposed to other forms of like liberal feminism. So the real question is, why are autistic Christians and non-Christians interested in radical feminism? If you had to guess, Marie, why? Why are so many autistic women interested in radical feminism? Why is this like a lamp that attracts a specific type of autistic moth to it?
I think that to just do without even looking at feminism, if you look at a lot of research on autistic people, ASD1 level, autistic people tend to have trouble whether they relate to like society and social constructs and socialization in different ways than neurotypical or holistic people do. And a big thing, which is very much a part of it's socially constructed, it's a way that people relate to each other, is gender. And it is simply true that autistic people, and you can see this across many different domains, and it's expressed in many different ways, autistic people have very different ways of relating to gender and sexuality than neurotypical or holistic people do. So I think that once you've taken that into account, it makes sense that autistic people have like very different ways of like looking at this and approaching this. You also have there, and I think that like within the autistic Christian community, I think they're different. I think they're there are reasons, like other reasons for that as well. But I would just generally say it's mostly due to the fact that, especially like autistic women, like view their gender kind of very differently than like holistic women do.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. Like, I think if in terms of like broad strokes, that's exactly it. And that's why most autistic women get into it. Gender and autistic men is an interesting question because most autistic men don't think much about gender. Most are pretty oblivious to it and don't consider it very much. And autistic women, however, think about gender all the time and they hate it. That's basically the dichotomy between the sexes. If you listen to the episodes that I did on autistic attitudes towards various gender topics and like sex differences between autistics and things like that, the thing that will commonly come up is men don't really think a whole lot about this or haven't really formed solid opinions, but like autistic women, they know and they have an idea. And it's usually, yeah, gender exists and I hate it versus men who are like, what's gender?
I do think this is actually like something that's also common among holistic people as well. If you look at it from I do think I wonder what radical feminists tend to be very skeptical of any kind of sort of social construction of gender because they view it as a form of like dominance and hierarchy and control. And I think just put it in like very simply, like not jargony terms, the way that I would translate this is kind of like by saying like, when in even more patriarchal times, when women were really subjugated and people were coming up with the concepts of gender, men took a lot of the good stuff for themselves. So when men are like, oh, logic is male, and then women get intuition or something, I do think that masculinity is more appealing, and I don't think that is a mistake. I think part and parcel is it's just that masculinity tends to be more appealing. Men tend to like conforming to their gender roles more than women like conforming to their gender roles. It's been noticed like women like to be viewed as people, meanwhile for a man to be viewed as a person is viewed as a kind of demotion, because there's an extra like you get like being a good man is in some ways like in a gendered way better than being like a good person. So I do think that difference that you see in autistic communities is actually something that you see like in holistic communities like as well.
Yeah, this certainly isn't an autism exclusive phenomenon, but this is one of those phenomena that I think when you add autism in the mix, it just pushes you further along the poles. It's pretty much like what I found with every phenomena. Like you will basically find the same gender trends in autistic people. It's just autistic people end up on the further edges of each side of the bell curve. And this topic is no exception. And yeah, if you told a radical feminists this, they would absolutely not be surprised, and they'd be like, yeah, of course men don't think about it. And their ideas that like that man is the default in the way that society has been constructed, and so the default is man, so of course the man's not thinking about being a man. He is the default. He is who the society is built to support, and who the society is built around. So yeah, of course you wouldn't really think about it. Whereas if you're a woman, you are in the non-default or in the second class subjugation. So of course you are going to be thinking about the terms and the conditions of your subjugation and why you feel that way. And yeah, so I've broken it down into a few explanations, and I'll just get your thoughts on these. So the first one is the one that you talked about is I think just gendered experiences are a lot more complicated in autistic women. Just surveying autistic men and autistic women think about gender a lot. And they think about gender a lot because it is much harder for an autistic woman to conform to femininity than it is for an autistic man to conform to masculinity. If you think of stereotypes of men, you will find categories that the average autistic man can slot into very easily. The eccentric professor, the sort of like stoic, brooding lead character, like the sort of people have referred to John Wick as like autistic action movie because there's like very little dialogue, very little social stuff. He basically just shows up and shoots people. There is a movie called The Accountant that's literally an autistic guy just shooting people and doing math. And these have you seen it?
I have not seen this movie.
Okay, it's literally there are two of them now. Yeah, I like to joke about The Accountant. It's a movie that boldly asks, "What if your accountant had autism?" What would it be like? Anyway, yeah. So there are lots of different archetypes that are commonly known that autistic men can fall into, with some problems, and like autistic men still have issues fitting into their gendered expectations. A lot of them have difficulties, but when you look at for women, especially women within Christianity, which is a population that I look at, there are a few archetypes. None of them are for autistic women, or very few of them are for them. It is so hard to be an autistic woman and to match the ideals of femininity that you are given, or like the moral exemplars of femininity that you are to strive towards. You have some nuns who had eating disorders and were exceptionally like weird mystics. That's
Okay,
it.
don't do Catherine of Siena like that.
It's not just Catherine of Siena, but like, if you think about Christian paragons or archetypes
Yeah.
for femininity, you basically have none. Like you have be a weird nun, and that's pretty much the only role that you could typecast as autistic. Whereas
Yeah,
with men, there are several that you can fit into. And like I
sure.
definitely notice this.
This is something that's like very active in terms of just recently, like this past summer, I was visiting some of the like friends that I'd grown up with, and there was a friend there whom they were like basically the group of friends were like trying to set him up with somebody because like we were talking about like dating and relationships. And the woman who was like saying, oh, there's like someone I would like you to meet, the qualities that she said, oh, like I think you could get very on together. She really wants to have kids. She wants to get married and just pop out babies. And it was really sort of stark for me to kind of listen to that, because to be like, oh, there's nothing like, oh, like you two both enjoy music, or she has a nice smile, like sort of the like, oh, she just wants to have lots and lots of children and do that as rapidly and quickly as possible, is seen in like still in a lot of like Christian communities. And this is not a community that would brand itself as, not one which like talks a lot about like headship, or one that talks a lot about, I don't know, like women are wearing pants. Like this isn't an absurd, particularly like repressive community. So like these ideas are very common in Christianity, and they are prevalent. And I think that I think that's just something that is tough for, I think a lot of just women, not like holistic women, but I think autistic women are particularly sensitive to that as well, for the reasons that you described too.
Yeah, and so there's another really common experience with autistic women, which is, this is common across both sexes, but particularly stark in autistic women, is the feeling of bodily alienation, especially as you hit puberty and go beyond. You go before as a girl, and then a switch flips and you start becoming a woman, and your body starts to change, and then you start to become heavily sexualized in a way that you weren't before. This doesn't happen to men. This doesn't happen with men. And having that is often like a bit of a kick in the face when you hit puberty and you start realizing, oh, these things have now changed for me. And now like people treat me differently, and people treat me differently because of the body that I have. And that like feeling is totally explained in radical feminism, right? If you want an answer for why that's happening, I've got some people who will tell you. They're radfems, right? And they will give you a coherent and relatable answer that you will immediately be able to be like, oh yes, that is how I feel, and that's how I'm feeling. I talk to a lot of autistic women, and they'll describe like reading Dworkin for the first time as a sort of spiritual experience, where they're like, I felt like I was reading a prophet, right? Like a literal prophetic text that was giving me words to explain how I felt in a way that I didn't think was possible. And just like for a lot of autistic women, femininity and the expectations of femininity are just uncomfortable. They're irrational, which is a big one I hear a lot, is they say, this is irrational. This doesn't make sense. And they just find it alienating. And then there are lots of additional social dynamics. Like women are expected to do a lot of the social management and the executive function management, and do a whole bunch of the invisible social labor that holds communities together. And when you're autistic and you don't really pick up on that, other people notice that you're not picking up on that and you're not doing womanhood, and they'll attack you for it, like either explicitly or implicitly, or they'll alienate you, or they'll socially isolate you. And you realize you're being socially isolated because you're not playing the role of woman like they expect you. And you're like, this is dumb. I don't want to do this. A really common example is the woman's Bible study. So you have the men's Bible study where they do and read through a commentary on Galatians or something like that. And you get the women's Bible study where you talk about how to be good for your husband, or how to prepare yourself for your future husband. And you're like, I want to be in the commentary Bible study. Why am I here? This doesn't make any sense. I should be in the commentary Bible study. I have lots to contribute. I have ideas. I have thoughts. Why am I not there? Why am I stuck here talking about how to be a good submissive wife? This is not what I'm interested in. And, who has answers to that feeling? The radical feminists. Like, you read them and they'll describe these exact dynamics and be like, look, this exists and it's bad. And this shouldn't be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. This doesn't make sense when you think about it. And the only reason we're doing it is because we're just in this, there's so much societal momentum behind it, and we're just going along with the current. We don't need to.
Yeah.
And that's often like a liberating experience, reading that for the first time.
I think there's also a general sense, you get this more in older, writing about autism, or especially with autism in women, that there's this idea that autistic women have more trouble performing their gender, and this is in secular writing about autism.
Yeah.
I think you just see that much more in Christianity, because Christianity has had for a long time a pretty gendered split. There's a lot of gendered ideology when it comes to complementarity and all of this stuff and different social roles. And I think that again, there's just more. There's in a religion that has a lot of ideas about what womanhood looks like and the certain roles that women have. Of course, there's going to be much more friction and what people are going to push back against too.
Yeah, and a really common thing autistic women say just to that point is, I don't really relate to femininity. And what they're talking about is what femininity is constructed in Christianity. And again, radical feminists will talk about that. They will talk about femininity being a trap and a prison and something that we need to transcend and something we need to abolish. We shouldn't have femininity and masculinity. We should not have these standards. You don't need this role. And for a lot of autistic women, this is the only place they'll hear it, especially if they're Christian. They're not going to hear that from the pulpit. They're not going to hear that from their friends. They're going to hear that from radfems though, and they're going to go, oh.
Yeah, I was about to say this actually, I would say a core thing that is very popular now in general is, we need to come up with a better masculinity that's not a toxic mixed masculinity like Andrew Tate. And what radfems say is it's all bad. It's all toxic. There is any gender this. And I frankly think that the way this idea is coherent is that masculinity is very much, and you see this not just in radfem writing, but in a lot of literature about the sociology and anthropological view of what masculinity is. It is defined by actually being not woman. It's the obverse of woman being the not man. But it's the idea that to be masculine is to reject femininity. And I think that if one's masculinity is predicated on the rejection of womanhood, that seems to imply a subjugation or an otherness or a lesser of womanhood. And then I also find it odd the positive masculinity models that are frequently given, or courage, or love of country, or wanting to provide and protect for one's family. Why can't women be courageous? Women can love their countries. Women can want to provide, protect for those families. Why is this gendered? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, exactly. And radfems speak directly into that. And often a really big thing is autistic women are extremely online, and they are extremely online often on more intellectual spheres and places. And if you are a woman online and in these more intellectual spaces, what are you going to encounter? You are going to encounter people making edits of Andrea Dworkin quotes and posting it, or it is almost impossible to be an autistic woman and not encounter radical feminism in the places that you probably hang out in. It will show up there in your algorithms, and then you will see someone being actually, we don't need a healthy masculinity. We just need to not have either of these categories, please.
Yeah, exactly.
And that sort of leads into my next observation, which is the sort of just complete abject failure of other systems to adequately explain the autistic woman's experience of their own womanhood. I think it was you who actually told me this, about an experience you were having where someone was talking about femininity and masculinity and actually using the term women are separate but equal,
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah.
With no hint
Separate
of
but equal
irony.
was. No, this was said with a straight face.
Yeah, and it's
Oh, no.
this is your counter explanation, right? You go to Catholic social teaching about what women are and what men are, and you go, wow, this sucks. I hate this. This doesn't
Yeah.
this doesn't describe me. This doesn't cohere with me. One of my closest friends is a forensic investigator. She's a digital forensics investigator. She works in counter trafficking stuff, and she's there is literally no place for me within Christian gender teaching. There is no situation in which I would be allowed to do this under any coherent system, because the work I do is dangerous, and I am putting myself in danger by doing this. I am putting don't have a family. I can't have a family, and I can't have a family because a lot of what I'm doing is not safe. And that's how it should be, right? I should be allowed to do this. I am living out my Christian life, but I'm living out the Christian life that would be acceptable for a man, right? No one looks at a soldier who's a Christian and goes, shouldn't be a soldier, young man. You should not be ascribing to these virtues of self sacrifice. But they do that for women. And there's just a complete lack of good alternative explanations out there. And radical feminist writing is just very punchy and direct. Like, you read it and they don't really beat around the bush in a lot of places, especially ones like Dworkin. And you have people talking in vague, fuzzy conceptual terms about womanhood and womanliness, and like often not wanting to say the quiet part out loud or not fully follow through on the assumptions that they're making, because to do that would make things awkward. But radical feminists just go for the throat. A lot of their writing is very hard to read work and come away with the idea that she might have been holding some in reserve, right? Or something like that. And this just directly appeals to autistic women, because when you don't have other explanations and then this one shows up and it's actually here, we're going to be extremely direct. We're going to talk about this right to your face. We're just going to say what needs to be said. That is deeply appealing. Another factor that I've noticed is having to deal with the specter of sexual violence, specifically male sexual violence or male sexuality. Extremely common for autistic women to experience sexual violence, even when compared to the general population. So autistic women are more likely to experience sexual violence, sexual harassment, and that type of thing. And it's often because they have difficulty reading social cues. One of the big reasons is they will get themselves into socially dangerous situations that they don't realize are socially dangerous, because what other women might have picked up as red flags, they have not. And they have not because they're autistic, and autistic people are bad at picking up on social red flags. This isn't to say it's like the autistic woman's fault or anything like that. It's absolutely not. But it just so happens that because of this, either men will specifically go for women they perceive as being more vulnerable or more socially aloof or socially isolated, or because they like lack the same self-preservation instincts that other people have, they will be in situations that are more dangerous. And so this leads to autistic women either having closer proximity to sexual violence or knowing other women who have a close proximity to sexual violence. And the number of autistic women who tell me that they were like groomed as teenagers is sort of shocking. The like groomed online is it was not near. I expected it to be lower, but like the number who talk about that or being taken advantage of. And radical feminism gives them answers to explain this. And it gives them very good, coherent answers. And good, coherent answers that aren't like, oh, maybe you deserved it. It's always, no, actually, there is a specter of patriarchal violence, and it is specifically designed to oppress women and keep them subjugated. And this is about men wanting to possess women and dominate them and treat them like objects. And just like the experience of being sexualized, a lot of autistic women find deeply uncomfortable and deeply discomforting. And this feeds into it. Also, just seeing sexual objectification is something that a lot of autistic women don't like a lot. Like the just looking at the culture and how the culture treats women like sexual objects, they're like, I hate this because I don't want to be seen as this. I want to be seen as an intellectual. I want to be seen as an equal. I don't want to be seen as a thing. And radical feminism talks directly to those experiences and talks directly to those experiences in ways that Christianity just doesn't. Like there is no equivalent game in town that really does quite as good of a job of doing it as someone like Catherine McKinnon, at
Yeah,
least in my opinion.
I would agree with that. I think in terms of just the general like social awareness, I had an experience once when I'd lost my wallet in a Target, and so I was walking to the Target trying to look for my wallet, and I was stopped by a security guard who told me that he was worried about me because he had been like watching me look for my wallet, and he said that I seemed like I lacked so much social awareness that he worried that he basically said that like bad people, men, would like notice this and could take advantage of this. So this is something which, when you say that like autistic women are frequently like the victims of sexual violence perpetrated by men, this is something which rings very true. The other thing too, yeah, I think that the idea, like sexual objectification, is something which I think that like radical feminism provides a through line between the kind of general sexual objectification and and sexual violence. I think that radical feminism provides like a really, it actually blends well with Christianity here in terms of Christianity. The Christian sexual ethic tends to look, is not like pro-sex work. It is not, is against porn. That's something that radical feminists agree on, as well as if you think about like in the Gospels, like if your eye leads you to sin, pluck it out. This is something which like you have, like in which Christ is talking about like not objectifying women. This is something that radical feminists would actually agree with too. So I think that's where there are some strong commonalities.
Yeah, and I think it is important to note that while those strong commonalities exist, that is not always how they play out in the way that Christianity is practiced.
Oh no.
Like often those things get like if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, gets turned on women in Christianity, right? It's like, this is your fault. If you have caused your brother to sin or stumble by wearing a short skirt or whatever, like this is just because this, while I agree there are lots of compatibilities that we'll talk about later, should also be stated, a lot of autistic women's experience of Christian sexual ethics is not of like that
Well, yeah,
particular
actually,
aspect.
I actually think that kind of makes sense in terms of autistic Christian women are told, like they read the Gospels and they see this, and but then their social experience is one that's very different. I remember when I was in middle school, I was homeschooled. I was a huge nerd. There was a woman once told off my mother for alleging that I was dressed in a manner which was distracting to her high school age sons. To be completely clear, I was in like seventh grade, a total nerd, was probably wearing a jean skirt down to my ankles. Like, this was ridiculous.
Yeah.
That was the year which was like my special interest was, like, I kid you not, like Lord Nelson and the Napoleonic era
Yeah.
British Navy.
Yeah. That is so funny. We had an overlapping special interest at age 12. Anyway, I just think that's funny. To your point.
No, yeah. So I think that's also part of it too, is that there's a disconnect. I think you said this earlier, like there's a disconnect between what is said and what is actually left unsaid that like autistic women like have trouble with. And I think as a radical feminist, I think are rightly pointing out like the real contradictions here too.
Hey everyone. If you're enjoying this podcast and want to support my work, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting if you're listening on YouTube, or rating and reviewing the podcast on whatever app you listen to it on. Some people have asked me if they can support my research, work, and podcast, or encourage me to continue doing this work that many autistic people find valuable. If my work has been helpful for you, and you have the means to do so, I would appreciate if you could make a single donation or sign up for recurring monthly donations to the Against Malaria Foundation. I'll provide a link in the description. This is a very effective charity that helps prevent malaria by donating bed nets to people who need them. Each net costs around $2 and lasts for 3 to 4 years and protects on average 2 people. The statistics on this are well known. Every 600 nets that are provided saves 1 child from dying of malaria, and around 500 to 1,000 cases of malaria get prevented. Every single net matters. Even if you can only make a small donation, I would greatly appreciate it, as it really helps motivate me. So far, we've already raised well over $500, and I have to say, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much to everyone who contributed. This does make a difference, and this really does help me want to continue pursuing this work. In addition, this podcast has merch. We use Teespring as a provider. I can provide a link in the description. There you can find many fun stickers that have themes that come up in this podcast, shirts, or mugs. Any of the proceeds from the merch will be donated to the Against Malaria Foundation and shared with the artists. That's all for now. Back to the podcast. Another really big factor in all of this is like willingness, I call it the willingness to just bite the bullet, and just the willingness that autistic people have to accept radical or unpopular ideas in their social circumstances. For a lot of Christian women, they won't even touch radical feminism. Like, it won't even be something that they consider listening to or something that they would consider engaging with at all. And a lot of autistic women just don't feel that social pressure to conform and don't feel that need to not read these things or to not expose themselves. In fact, they often have the complete opposite, like a sort of contrarian, I do what I want, you can't tell me what to read, you can't tell me what to look at sort of mentality. And this isn't unique to feminism, this is across the board. Autistic people will take their unpopular ideas to their most logical extent. Like, you find within the effective altruist community especially, you find like a lot of autistic people just absolutely getting nerd sniped by like long-termism and potentialities of futures and all these types of things, where you have really high stakes issues with low probabilities, and they will get super nerd sniped by those things and completely unbothered by the fact that everyone else around them looks at them like they're a little crazy. These types of things, I think, scare normal women away from radical feminism, at least normal women in Christianity, whereas this has virtually no effect on autistic women. So they just don't feel the shame or the impulse from it. They're just like, I'm willing, if they're right, and if they're right, I'll take them to what their logical extent should be. And so there just isn't that push away factor for autistic women that there might be for others. I think related to this as well is autistic people just have more cognitive rigidity, more tendencies to think in black and white, more tendencies to think in moral absolutes and adopt extreme positions. And it's the sort of follow your ideas to their logical conclusion thing. And autistic people quickly polarize themselves. And this is across the autistic spectrum. We're just prone to polarization wherever we are and thinking in moral extremes. And radical feminism is itself thinking in moral extremes for a lot of things. And so that way of thinking just completely appeals to them. And so you have that. Another part is just a desire to be part of radical groups. Autistic people often just take pride in being standouts, in being controversial, contrarian, and being outsiders, and, not really conforming to these ideas. A lot of us take pride in being heterodox thinkers and in standing outside the social norms and living on the edge for a lot of reasons. Like, autistic people get drawn in for a lot of these reasons. Autistic people get drawn into like cults or weird societies. And I'm not saying radical feminism is a cult or anything like that, but the sort of dynamics that bring you into groups of weird people are at play here. And this desire to be part of radical groups like is just everywhere. And like I said, a lot of them are drawn to people like Andrew Dworkin was once described as like an Old Testament prophet storming through the countryside. And I think that is a reason that a lot of autistic people are specifically drawn to her. Another factor, I think, is seeking explanations in light of a lack of diagnosis. So autistic women are way less likely to be diagnosed with autism than autistic men. And because they're not diagnosed and they feel something is off, they are looking for an explanation. Like, why does this feel off? Why don't I relate to this? What's wrong with me? What's going on here? Why is this not working out for me? And because they don't have the answer that they're autistic, they go looking for answers in other places. And a sort of, why do I struggle with gender conformity? Why can't I be like the other girls? Why am I struggling so much? Why is femininity so hard for me to put on when it's so easy for my sister? Lots of questions like that. And radical feminism gives you answers, and it gives you pretty compelling answers. And it gives you pretty compelling answers that will work if you are an autistic woman or if you're holistic. Like, if you're not autistic, if you are autistic, these will give you answers as to why, as a woman, you are feeling socially and bodily alienated. And given that bodily and social alienation is like one of the biggest features of the autistic experience, having some sort of ideological system that can explain those for you is deeply appealing. And so, yeah, radical feminism just fits that role where a diagnosis isn't given. And so you look for answers more aggressively than other people might, and then find radical feminism and find the answers appealing.
Oh, something that occurred to me when you mentioned working, and also like the unfortunate fact that autistic women face like elevated levels of sexual violence, is that also there's also the kind of lots of like Dworkin was often like very much accused of having hating on men and having a very bad relationship with her own father, which she repudiated. And I do think, and she I think Dworkin herself said that she had a very good relationship with her father, and it was her disillusionment with the way that other men acted that had led to her embracing her feminism. And that is also something which I very much identify with. And I think it's something also too that perhaps is common with like autistic women, is like if you have parents whom or fathers or brothers who have experiences with kind and non-sexist like relatively speaking, or like open-minded, respectful men, and then you go out into the world and you're like, wait a minute. As you understand, as you your experiences both with other people as well as the kind of like experiences like with broader society, this can be, I think, a radicalizing experience as well.
Yeah. So that's actually very common. You mentioned that a lot of people are like, "Oh, you must hate your dad." And it's actually that's the opposite for a lot of these women. A lot of these women love their dad and they're like, "My dad is great and I realize most men aren't." And I know what you could be. You can't hide that from me. I've seen it firsthand. You are capable of being a non-sexist dickhead. But here you are.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
exactly.
that's super common. And so another factor we've already touched on is there are a lot of autistic women who are already radical feminists, and you are likely to encounter autistic people in radical feminist circles. And a lot of times, autistic people just go through life feeling alienated, feeling like people don't relate to them, that they can't understand people. And then they show up to these communities, and there are a bunch of autistic women there, and they're like, oh, finally, people who get me. This must be ideological. And half the time, maybe it is ideological, but there's also the other factor of you finally met other people that you can socially relate to because they also have autism. It's called homophily. It's like a pretty well documented effect where wherever a critical mass of autistic people start to gather, more autistic people will join those communities. Not because of anything because of the community, but because they're finally able to meet people who they can relate to and talk to. And also, adding to that, autistic people are evangelists. They are intellectual evangelists. If they are into something, they're going to let you know, right? They will talk about it. And so if one, like I've often seen, like, how did you get into radical feminism? My friend got into it and she was just telling me about this, and then I got into it because she was into it. And so that sort of like evangelization effect with all these factors that like pull autistic Christian women into radical feminism or radical feminist adjacent positions, they get pulled in by other autistic women who are also in their communities and pulling them. I have accidentally done this to a lot of autistic women over the course of my research career when they tell me things like, oh yeah, you'd probably like Andrea Dworkin because she says this and this, and they're like, whoa. Yeah, so yeah, I have a tendency of leaving radical feminists in my wake while storming through the autistic Christian countryside. But yeah, so those are basically my explanations for why radical feminism is popular with autistic women, and more specifically autistic Christian women. But now the big question is radical feminism and Christianity actually compatible? Because we've been talking about these things, and you might be thinking from what we've said is, yeah, obviously every autistic Christian woman would be a radical feminist. But that is not the case. And it's not the case because there might be a few compatibility issues. As we were talking about before this call, you were talking about reading Firestone and how her solution in most of her writings is like fully automated luxury gay space communism.
Specifically pansexual cybernetic communism is what she calls it.
Yeah, and so yeah, that might not be super appealing to autistic women or autistic Christian women for various reasons. To some, it might be very appealing. It certainly doesn't have a universal appeal. But
Yeah,
yeah, so
sure. I mean,
do you think they're do you think they're compatible?
I do think they are compatible. I do think that there are some out there things which, so for example, I'm not sure, as someone who is, as you use the word evangelist, like I try to be careful when discussing radical feminism because there are some ideas which, like, I will say the brand already isn't great. And
It's
so
true.
like people don't really tend to like radical feminists in general because they're viewed as like difficult women, or as my sister, who is a feminist as well but not a radical feminist, she said this jokingly, this is not like a cause of serious strife, so just to be clear, she once turned to me while I was babbling about radical feminism and she said, why can't you be normal?
So yeah, I talk to my wife about this kind of thing all the time, and she goes, "Oh, radical feminism, that's so cool, that's awesome." And then I like been like, and they also think, and she's like, "What the hell?"
Yeah.
Yeah,
So recently, I was texting a friend who's very interested in animal rights, like, and
yeah.
also like animal liberation, which is its
Oh
own
no, where's this
thing.
going?
So work in rights. I think it's in women hating that, like in
She does.
you know where I'm
I know.
going with this.
Yeah, this is exactly where I
um,
thought it was going. Okay.
yeah, that in a future where we have like in a future where there is like where women are liberated, like animals will be also elevated to the erotic plane. This does not entail bestiality because it would not be the sexual abuse of animals, but I don't really know what that actually looks like. So I sent this to my friend and he didn't understand what this looks like either. So basically, what I'm saying is that I think that to say that I don't want to be too conservative in saying that like radical feminists have to agree or sign off on every single thing that like other radical feminists have written or endorsed, because one, that would make the camp far too small, and two, there are many disagreements, as we'll talk about, with trans issues within radical feminism as well. So I think that like also in talking about the compatibility issues, like there are things which one does not necessarily have to fully agree on to not and I still think that like I could have my doubts about what it means to elevate animals to the erotic plane and I can still call myself a radical feminist.
Yeah, we should clarify. Dworkin did walk back that chapter
Yeah.
later in her life. She received critique for it and accepted that critique and walked it back later. To be very clear, she has said many things which she has walked back. Oftentimes, radical feminists are playing with ideas out loud in academic settings and forgetting that other people read them.
Yeah, you get this a lot with Firestone as well. So yeah, I do want to be clear about that as like that too. That just because someone is a radical feminist doesn't mean that they've signed on for every single thing that every radical feminist has said.
Yeah, radical feminists have. I find Firestone just very like, it's like, all right, okay, sure. I don't find her as compelling. Some of the things where she talks about the need for external wombs for women to fully be liberated, I'm like, okay, I'm following you there. But when she starts talking about children and like children's liberation and family abolition and
Yes.
stuff like that, it's okay, I think we may have advanced beyond our logistics chain here.
Yeah.
We may have outstretched the front line a bit.
I do think that Firestone is very right. And I think that Dworkin would agree with her on issues in which like the family and the nuclear family can be a site of women, of the subjugation of women and children, the oppression of women and children. Whether or not abolishing the family is a feasible solution is something that I think there could be like plausible like disagreement about. But I do think a radical feminist would take Firestone's critique of the nuclear family relatively seriously.
Yeah, and so this is what I was going to bring up. So I think radical feminist critiques are compatible with Christianity. I don't think radical feminist solutions are necessarily compatible with Christianity. I think when they are explaining, like, the nuclear family is a site for women's oppression, that's sort of, I think that's sort of uncontroversially true, especially when you look at how, like, motherhood and families used to be. Like, women were literally the property of their husbands. I don't know how you could take that framework and be like, no, that's not a site of women's oppression. Like, very obviously is. However, when it comes to solutions, the solution is like pansexual cybernetic communism. That itself is not necessarily Christianity compatible, but looking at the family as a source of oppression, you'll have that, and then you'll talk to autistic women and you go, what do you how do you feel about this? And they'll quote Jesus talking about who is my mother, who is my brother, and these types of things, and be like, look, there are strains of Christian thought. Like when you become a nun or a monk, you cleave yourself from your family and become married to Christ. Like you literally abolish those ties to separate yourself in this
I also
way.
I also think that, so very fundamentally, what radical feminists are trying to do is they're trying to make the biological fact of male versus female to have basically very like no cultural significance. So this is something which I think that's maybe literally. I was reading Firestone like actually just yesterday, so I may be literally quoting her there. I think that this actually works very well with lots of like Imago Dei theology, in terms of that both women and men are made in the image of God, and that this is the way that we like should relate to each other. This is something also too which I'm currently Catholic. I also have attended like Quaker meetings, and it's something which I find very appealing about the Quaker tradition as well. Just really understanding the value and like the inner light within each human person and the dignity of each human person. And I think that is actually extremely compatible with radical feminism.
Yeah, and there are also like church fathers you could read. So one of the main examples is like Gregory of Nyssa, but also Origen, if you count him, talk about like gender as being a consequence of the fall and something purely incidental because of the way that sin entered the world. And when sin enters the world, there is a need for sexual reproduction, but in a resurrected world, there will be no need for this and no reason to deal with that type of thing anymore. And
Yeah.
yeah, so like when it comes to it, I would say radical feminism has a very strong critique of Christianity. I would say probably also a warranted critique. Like when I read their critiques of Christianity, I'm like, you're not wrong. like you are kind of just right about a lot of this. And Christianity has a lot of critiques of ideas that would be found in radical feminism. If you read Catholic social teaching on like family and things like that, they go hard against radical feminists. If you look at Vatican encyclicals on gender, they will like they're calling out Firestone and going hard against, especially when they talk about like gender ideology. What they're talking about is often second wave feminism and second wave ish stuff.
I will say Catholics now, when they refer to gender ideology, tend to be referring more to LGBTQ issues.
Yes,
Um,
yes. But in those
in the
previous, like these
previous,
are, yeah,
it is feminism that has somewhat been superseded by
yes, yeah. I would say,
newer concerns.
and from talking to autistic Christian women who call themselves radical feminists, usually what they say is something like, look, I know these things are not 100% compatible, and there isn't a way to make them both simultaneously fit, but there are streams of Christianity and streams of radical feminism that can at least play nice with each other. Like they don't necessarily need to be at each other's throats. And there are forms of Christianity that can be mostly compatible and forms of radical feminism that can be mostly compatible. Most of Christianity, however, won't be,
Yes,
is what they'll say.
I think that's true. So, Dworkin is maligned and slandered by when people, she's misquoted as saying that all heterosexual sex is rape. This is not ever something that she wrote.
And
And
something that she explicitly said she didn't write, and when
yes,
asked to clarify, did clarify that she does not believe this.
exactly. So this is not anything that she wrote or stood by ever. This is just, but frankly, most people, when you say Dworkin, they say, oh, the lady who said all heterosexual sex is rape, which is very odd. That's what's been, frankly, very sadly for people who don't really engage with radical feminism, that's been her legacy. Which she actually does celebrate. She views it as I think it's also at the end of, I think this comes up in women hating as well. She celebrates it like whenever two people come together in love and a situation which is not based on a hierarchy of like dominance, power, control. This is a beautiful thing and should be celebrated. And so that's the way which I view like radical feminists have very strong criticisms of marriage and I think that many of those criticisms of marriage, frankly, are warranted. However, I do not think that like it is necessary to say then that any kind of like I think it is possible to envision like a Christian marriage, which actually it is actually somewhat compatible with the tenets of radical feminism in terms of relationships, in terms of if you were able to embrace like another person and make these kinds of commitments with that does not have hierarchy, like power, control. That's something beautiful and actually should be celebrated.
Yeah, and really it comes down to the question of, can Christianity be practiced outside of the context of male supremacy and patriarchy? And if you answer yes to that, then they are compatible. If you answer no to that, then they aren't compatible. And so
I
this sort
think
of like, this is the core place where the autistic Christian women who are explicitly radical feminists will say, no, Christianity can be practiced faithfully without the need for male supremacy and patriarchy, and without the need for harsh gender distinction and things like that. And so, in that way, if you adopt that tack, then I think they can be compatible, mostly because I know people who think they are. So
I
it obviously works for some people.
I think they are theoretically compatible. I do think the way that most people live and practice their Christianity is not compatible with radical
Yeah.
feminism.
Yep. And most radfem autistic Christians will say that. They'll say most ways of practicing Christianity aren't compatible, but that doesn't mean there is no way that is compatible. Like how for most of Christian history, Christianity was compatible with holding slaves. Like there was no conception that there was a Christianity incompatible with holding slaves. But now we look at the question and they go, of course, it's morally abhorrent. You can't be a Christian and hold slaves. They would say, we can get that way with gender relations. We can get that way with gender. And it is, in fact, desirable that we get to that state with gender where we look back on it and say, yeah, we used to practice Christianity in a way that was bad, but now we can practice it in a much better way. And they would say, and this is the trajectory that Christianity should be following, and the one that they believe God wants it to be followed. They would also emphasize that. A lot of them will often say, I'm a bad Christian or a bad radfem, depending on the day. That's another comment that comes up a lot. They're like, look, like I could put on my radfem hat and I could put on my Christianity hat. Sometimes I can put them on at the same time, and sometimes I can only wear one and only wear the other. And I just deal with it because I think both Christianity is true on some fundamental level and radical feminism is true on some fundamental level. And so I take the compatibilities where I can find them, but I also realize that in some places, Christianity, especially like if you adopt a gendered theology, it's just not going to be able to live well with radical feminism. Yeah, the typical tension points that give a lot of cognitive dissonance, like the biggest one is abortion. Radical feminists are very pro abortion, like explicitly pro abortion in every case, pretty much. When you read radical feminist literature, I don't think you could be a rad fem and anti abortion. I don't know of a way that you could do that without, again, invoking, even if you were to invoke a future where you have like artificial wombs and stuff like that. I still don't think there would be a feminist, like a radical feminist way of opposing abortion. And that is obviously a very controversial issue within Christianity. Yeah. So that's one big tension point. How do you navigate that one?
I Oh gosh.
You don't need to talk about it. I can talk
No,
about.
it's just like I was like okay, I want to be very clear. Like I don't want to do heresy. So like I'm trying to steer clear of
Okay.
that too. Okay. I'm trying not to do a heresy, but I think that the way that Christian radfems would deal with this is that okay, I actually would push back a little bit on this in terms of the like having control over reproduction is very important for feminism for very obvious reasons. And so birth control is going to be really important here. And lots of Christians are very accepting of birth control. Some Christians are really not accepting of birth control. So I do, so I, so I actually
To put
think
it
that like
mildly.
that, yeah, exactly. So I actually think that's a tension which is, I think, underexplored. I do think that like radical feminism within the context of kind of pro birth control or accepting of birth control makes a lot more sense. I don't think it makes any sense with the again, this goes back to like different kinds of ethical like teaching. Abortion, this is also not something which I think birth control is not something that I think frankly makes too much sense within the Christian like history and tradition. Anti-abortion has been very much a part of Christian teaching for an extremely long time. Back to the earliest Christians, you see it in early Christian writings, like Christian, like, I think sometimes there's the argument made that like abortion is actually like is something that's new in the within the Christian idea. This is not true.
It's in
It's
the
very, very
Didache.
old. Yeah, exactly. I was thinking of saying that because I realized I didn't quite know how to pronounce it. So I was like, I'm not gonna butcher it. So
It's in
it's
the
it's a,
Didache. It's in the Epistle to Diognetus. It's like it's there at least in the 2nd century.
yeah. So it's very early. I do think though that like the way that I think many ought to like Christian women, this is not autistic Christian women, this is just like Christian women who are pro-choice, view this as, frankly, I do think that it is the moral intuitions that people generally have about what abortion is do tend to be very different over different kinds of like, different like moral intuitions that like people like generally have versus like murder. Therefore, it does make sense to put this in a different logical category, as well as that a lot of the arguments, the Christian arguments that are made for in terms of opposing abortion, are dependent on various like philosophical and theological tenets that secular people do not share, and thus in terms of abortion should be legal, for the legality of abortion argument versus the morality of abortion argument, they tend to be different things. And so you can be a pro-choice Christian woman who does not believe in the morality of abortion but believes in secular women being able to like make like autonomous choices, etc., and being able to understand that these are different arguments.
Yeah, so that's mostly how they handle it. So this is a position I call abortion for thee, but not for me, which is to say, you believe that abortion is wrong, it's not morally justifiable, it is killing an innocent life, or some variation of that statement. That being said, the government should not be allowed to interfere in these sorts of things because you have a specific idea for how the government should be structured and what sorts of things should be legal and what sorts of things should be illegal. Also, another thing that gets brought up is attempts to restrict abortion, even if they are well intentioned, will end up making life for women way worse. That's another very common talking point. So, like, even if you believed it was wrong, you might say this is one of those issues that if we attempted to enforce it, it would cause more harm than good. You may think there are lots of things that you could think is wrong. Like, you can think alcohol consumption is wrong, but also that prohibition was a bad idea or whatever.
Yeah, and you see this with also many other radfem concerns, such as pornography and sex work as well. So there are many women who are like ideologically opposed to sex work and want to like work, like actively work in like helping women escape sex work, but also do not want like the strongest bans or like legal bans because they view this as counterproductive to helping women. But this is not because they're coming from a place of viewing sex work as empowering or a woman exercising her agency. This is simply from a kind of just a very sort of practical point of view.
Yeah, it's like I don't think we can implement this well in policy, and I think any attempt to implement it in policy is going to ultimately hurt women more than it helps them. So I do not believe we should do that. That's typically how they navigate that. There are many other thoughts on the abortion for me but not for thee crowd. I detailed them more in a previous episode on autistic attitudes towards abortion if you'd like to listen more on that. But that's typically how they navigate those.
Also, the autonomy concerns are something which like feminist philosophers have discussed, like Judith Jarvis Thompson, of course, and
Yeah, the
something which
violinist
is,
thought experiment
yeah,
gets brought up a
exactly.
lot. Yep, that is the go-to. And yeah, so another big one that causes dissonance is family and children. Radical feminists have a lot to say about this, as we've been hinting at. And this is one of those situations in which a lot of them go, look, your analysis is right, but your solutions are insane. And I'm not like, I think people actually want their kids and should keep them. And I don't think forcibly taking them away to live on the commune is going to work here.
Yeah, so Simone de Beauvoir,
And
you wouldn't like Simone de Beauvoir's solution, which is no woman should have the choice to raise her own child because that's the choice that she should make. She would make, and that in order to have achieved the liberation of women, this is a choice that must be taken away, which is a bit paradoxical.
yeah, not super popular amongst autistic Christian women.
Yes, I agree with that. I would also say that you had a very good podcast for the book on the myth of good, like Christian parenting. And this is, I thought that was a really good example of if listening to that episode and the way that the family can become a site of patriarchal like violence and patriarchal, the way that patriarchal like ideas are like really enacted in the family. This is actually like really quite bad, and it's bad for families, it's bad for women, it's bad for kids, it's bad for the parents, it's like bad for everybody. I do think that wanting to have a family in a sort of radical like feminist way does take a huge amount of intention and thought, and frankly might not actually lead to true women's liberation. I do think Catherine McKinnon has a point when she says that a true feminist seeking true liberation will not be able to engage in like a heterosexual family. And I think that I do think that there are real, like, if you like, also, you're also the episode you did recently, the book of with Leah Labresco Sargent as well. There is a lot of, it's just true. There is a lot of dependence that's built into for a woman to become pregnant. There's a lot of danger there. When a woman is most vulnerable, of course, feminists are going to be concerned and have issues with placing women in a very vulnerable state. And I think that there are ways that these things can be mitigated, and like fundamentally, like these things I wouldn't necessarily say are at odds, but the solutions are not easy. They're very tough.
Yeah. And so all the things you say there are things that come up a lot. And Catherine McKinnon saying basically there isn't a way to feministly do heterosexual marriage and kids. And they're like, okay, but I'm a heterosexual woman who really wants kids. What am I supposed to do here? Like, just lie down and die?
Yeah.
Become a nun? Right? Like, these are your choices where they're like, look, and usually it comes back to what you're talking about with marriage, and marriage can be a situation in which there is patriarchal control and dominance and these things. But they're like, look, I think there is a way that we can practice this. Especially, they will talk about bringing in the Christian conception of love, and the family unit is the center of love and things like that. And we need to recognize that not all asymmetries in power are sites of oppression. So, an example I was recently given when I was talking to a woman was she has a severely disabled sister, and she's like, look, I have an enormous amount of power over my sister. I have complete control over her life. She's her full-time caretaker. And she's like, look, I this is not a site of oppression for my sister, though, just because she's sort of completely dependent on me. And she was talking about how, look, yeah, my sister is completely dependent on me, but this is a relationship of love and a relationship of care. And just because these asymmetries do exist doesn't necessarily mean that this is a place where these asymmetries are going to be enacted on in an oppressive way. And we can apply that to marriage. We can apply that to children and things like that. And we should, and we shouldn't necessarily, like, I get why radical feminists are the way they are. I get why they look at that. I get why they are cynical about these types of things. Cynicism is necessary to do this analysis, but there is also a place where perhaps we could be less cynical and more positive about these types of things, and more accepting of the place for love, even in a situation in which there can be these massive social asymmetries. So yeah, that's usually how they navigate that.
Yeah, I think that, so that there's kind of, this is, I'm a sibling with profound autism. And that's something which, with that example that you give, is very much like my experience as well, in terms of my brother is very much dependent on my parents and myself and our entire family for his like survival and happiness. And yet, like, this is not a relationship which is oppressive at all, really, in no way. I find, yeah, so I do think that's true. I also think too that, again, I'm not saying that like gender is, I think, a good thing. I do think it's very limiting in a lot of ways, but I do think that like a way of thinking of these kind of socially constructed things, I was thinking about, this is admittedly going to be a very odd analogy, but bear with me here. So there's a really good book, which is if you're interested in combat memoirs, it's probably one of my favorites. It's by a guy who's a Navy pilot during the secret bombing of Laos, and he was during the Vietnam War. And it's called The Rescue of Streetcar 304. Streetcar 304 is his call sign. And he shot down and he spends nearly 40 hours on the ground evading Pathet guerrillas and North Vietnamese regulars. And if he's captured, he'll probably be killed or, like, best case, sent to the Hanoi Hilton and tortured. Anyways, this is obviously a very stressful experience for him. The point of this whole thing, the setup, is that when this guy he eventually is rescued, but when he's, like, coordinating with the people who are going to rescue him, one thing that really stood out to me when I was reading this book was that he would think to himself, I'm a Navy pilot. I've got to stay cool so I can impress the Air Force guys. Which to me sounded like insane. Like, why are you, like, this inter-service rivalry is not important right now.
Oh, it is though.
But it's what I realized, like, this is keeping him alive, because if he's like focusing on the path of Lao who are around, like, he might lose his cool, etc. And so it's a crutch. And so I do think that, like, I don't want to, like, reify gender in any way, but I do think that, like, thinking about one of the things too, like, when I was thinking about, like, dependence and thinking about that, because I did read Miss, like, Labresco Sargent's, I think that's how she likes her book. In some ways, I found it deeply sad, given, like, the condition that women are in terms of having this kind of dependence foisted on them, both by culturally and biologically, and being forced to live in a man's world. But there are also ways in which, like, without maybe taking too sunny of a view of this, I do think, like, in your example of the disabled sibling or, like, disabled relative, like, understanding that sometimes these things actually can be useful, like, for survival, and also can be good and don't necessarily have to be negative, even if they are silly and socially constructed.
Yeah, so I think that's a good way of describing the ways of navigating those types of dissonances. Another factor is just, like, patriarchy is everywhere in Christianity. Like, patriarchy is there, baked into the structure of a lot of things. St. Paul's letters, like, literally invoking the paterfamilialis and the structure of Roman male headship in a lot of his writings. The way that autistic Christian women typically navigate this is to say, yeah, but, like, Christians have done a lot of bad and dumb things throughout the years. Just because we have done bad and dumb things doesn't mean we need to keep doing those bad and dumb things. Slavery is an example that comes up a lot. Like, Christians used to be super on board with slavery and not super opposed to it, and then now we're not, or now we are. And
Yeah.
I don't see why we couldn't do this with gender. And so that's usually how they navigate it. Like, oh, the church did many genocides, yes, and it was bad, and we shouldn't do that again.
No, exactly. I don't think it's true. Like, very few Inquisition defenders, unless you get to the very strange aspects of, like, very trad people and
Yes.
who are probably excommunicated for being sedevacantists from Catholicism. So, that's definitely, like, that's definitely true. I think that, like, Paul is also writing in an extremely patriarchal society. We also discussed this earlier. It's just the idea that, like, Christianity came about in an extremely patriarchal, like, society that, if you study, like, classical Rome and the Mediterranean at the period, it's mind-boggling how patriarchal this society is. And I was like, the paterfamilias, having power of life and death over everyone in its family. This it's a social system that is really negative. Frankly, I think it's negative for a lot of people, but it's especially negative for women and children. And so I think that, like, I think I said this to you earlier and you laughed at this, that I said, like, Paul is kind of the Andrea Dworkin of his time. And what I, like, in terms of he's just operating in a very different social context. A way of, like, thinking about this too, which I was thinking about recently. And so again, I think that in some ways, like, the sexism of the church in the past may have been a little bit like the inter-service rivalry in the example that I mentioned. Like, it may have been a useful social technology in a time where, like, frankly, the church was much more progressive on these issues than the rest of the time, in terms of, like, it's indulging in sexism is actually to be expected, even though that's something that, like, we as Christians today are actually called to, like, actively work against, because it's not worthy of of what we're called to be as, like, children of God. The other example I was going to give quickly is that, like, just like these outward relationships among the church have changed, like, very as, like, culture changes. So, for example, in church, like, frequently you'll have the sign of peace, which is like a handshake, or when you're supposed to greet people, like, your fellow, like, Christians in church. In the beginning, for about the first 1,000 years of Christianity, this was a kiss, and it was a kiss that was given on the mouth. And this was not something that was shared between members of the opposite sex, but it was shared within members of the same sex. This is because in the Mediterranean cultures of the time, greeting people was done with a kiss. in movies about ancient Rome now, like you have this thing called the Roman handshake, which is like two men will like clutch each other's forearms. This is fake. It was invented by Hollywood because showing two men kiss would read as gay to modern audiences.
Yes, and
So my
Paul
point,
instructs us to greet each other with a holy kiss.
exactly. And so
That was
these,
on the lips.
yes. So this is what I'm saying is that a lot of, I think, hewing too closely to what so much of like how we view like gender and sexuality and social norms, just like really understanding that so much of these are really socially constructed. And like you can just understand that also just by looking at the very basic history of Christianity, for example, what that sort of Christian kiss was and how that Christian greeting has changed over time to reflect that.
Yeah, and another factor that is often brought up is there's this quote by Mark Fisher in his book Capitalist Realism, where he's talking about capitalism, and he has a phrase, and it's something like, for many people living today, capitalism is so in the air that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than an end to capitalism. And I've heard autistic women quote basically that same thing at me, except to say for the early Christians, it was easier to imagine the end of the world than an end of gender. And like their idea of gender liberation was literally eschatological. Like in the end times, gender will be abolished in because that's the only way that they could think of these sort of dimorphic changes being unreified is with the undoing of the world. And a lot of autistic Christian radfems will say to me, like, that was what they thought at the time, but we have clearly developed to a point where it will no longer be the end of the world. And yeah, so that's typically the explanations that you'll get. I've already talked about these sort of autistic Christian to radfem pipelines in previous episodes. I'll just briefly touch over how it happens. The easiest way to explain it is a lot of autistic Christian women have radfem sleeper cell training baked into them by Christianity, especially when they're coming from the more conservative end of Christianity. I often joke that radfems and patriarchal Christians often have the same analysis of gender, except at the very end, radfems say, and this is bad, and we shouldn't do it. And the patriarchal Christians say, and this is good, and God wants it. And so a lot of autistic women are shocked to realize the first time they hear radfem talking points that it's like, oh, this is true. No, you're right. You've nailed it on the head. Like you get these beliefs like men are dangerous and sexually aggressive and unable to control themselves. And radfems are like, yes, we've been saying that. And that's because they're taught to do this by patriarchy. And this is a thing. And male sexuality is different from female sexuality. And radfems will be like, yes. And do you know why that is? We have an explanation, do you? And the role of women is to be subservient and submissive towards men. And they'll be like, yes, that is the role of women, which is why we need to get rid of gender. And women must guard and protect themselves from men. And they're like, yes. And do you know why that is? Because men are socialized to be this way as a project of patriarchal dominance and male supremacy. And this is why we need to get rid of it. And all these types of things. And then a lot of times, autistic Christian women will be under the impression that, oh, feminism is pro-porn or feminism is pro-prostitution because they encounter sort of a liberal feminism.
Or feminism is pro-sex.
Yes, or feminism is sex positive. And
yeah, exactly.
Then they encounter radfems, and radfems are like, no, we're not. And they go, wait a second. I could do all this and be weird about sex. This is great. Let's do this.
Yeah, I do think that the lib femmes who think that like sexuality, there's lots of meaning making and empowerment in sexuality. I do think the radical feminist critique that this is just simply a way of subordinating women for men's like desires is I do think that critique holds a lot of water, and I do think it is in some ways compatible with what conservative like women like or Christian women are taught. Although I do think too that I think it comes up in right wing women with android work and the idea that women the differences would be that I think that frankly the ways that I don't think conservative Christians would agree with this, but I think that in practice it does look like they're fine with the ownership of women as long as it's privately owned, and this is not something that a radfem Christian woman would agree with.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, the thing is, a lot of autistic Christian women, like I said, end up accidentally deriving radical feminism from first principles by just the sheer power of autism and the weight of Christian misogyny. And it happens a lot. The most frequent pathway is just disillusionment with misogyny in Christian communities that gets them to the radfem side and looking for answers when the structures that they were told were in place to protect them turn against them and start making their lives miserable, is often how they get here. The most common pathways here are basically having a proximity to sexual violence within Christian communities, or like sexual objectification within Christian communities, and going, what the hell, this wasn't supposed to happen here, why is this happening? And finding radical feminists talking about this and going, oh, that's why that was happening. Just being restricted from being able to do things on the basis of sex. You're not allowed in the men's Bible study, you have to go to the women's Bible study, or your goal is to be a wife and mother. And it's no, please no. And just being constrained in ways that men are not, and realizing that asymmetry is arbitrary and unfair, and that you can do that.
I mean, like the whole, I never want to hear the word help meet again.
Yeah, no, I can get it. Yeah.
It's always just seemed so, it's like, whenever it's like the, oh God, the drive, like the man is in the driver's seat, the whole analogy just makes my skin crawl. It's like, why? That just seems so convenient for men. I don't know. I find it.
Yeah. And yeah, so there's also a radfem to Christian pipeline. This one is way more complicated. Usually it starts with a major disillusionment from their current paradigm. So I talked to one woman who used to be like a political lesbian, and then she was like, okay, what am I doing? I'm literally heterosexual. I can't actually do this. I know sexuality is constructed and whatever, but like I am a straight woman. I like men and I want to be married and I'm 28. What am I doing here? And there's that essay, that famous essay trashing about infighting within radical feminist communities and things like that. That happens a lot. Autistic women are typically on the receiving end of a lot of trashing because they can't socially, they're weird, right? They're just weird girls, and often end up the sort of targets in these communities and get driven out. It's socially difficult to be in any part of a group. It's more socially difficult to be part of a radical group, especially if you disagree on one or two issues. The conflict with Israel and Palestine has caused a few of these. Conflicts with Russia, Ukraine caused a few of these. Like very big political upsets that start to form schisms in communities often blow up. And they start looking for another way to be because what they're currently doing is making them miserable. Another really common one is they're in leftist politics, and then there's a sex abuse scandal on the left, and the men cover it up and the women cover for the men, and they go, what the hell, we were supposed to be feminists, we weren't supposed to be doing this, why aren't we taking this more seriously? And that forms that starts to form disillusion.
I feel bad bringing up Firestone so much. I shouldn't. I read her recently, that's why. But she quotes Eldridge Cleaver, and if you know anything about the Black Panthers, respect for women wasn't really high on the list of what they were doing in terms of like literally murdering child sex workers. I think that was Huey Newton. But yes. Anyway, if you look at the
famous split on yeah, anyway.
Yeah, so there's a lot of like violent sexual abuse in the Panthers. So there's like I will say the intersectional feminism does have its points here in terms of pointing out that there are issues within like, as particularly like within like also like leftist movements are no panacea in terms of getting away from like gendered violence and negative gendered ideas, spaces, etc.
Yeah. And so this happens, and then these women go looking for something else. Right. And one of the things that they will sometimes encounter is Christianity, or they will encounter Christianity from specific women in their lives. This is usually not a like evangelical Christianity or a trad Catholic Christianity. It is often a left-wing progressive form of Christianity that they get introduced to, and then they start reading like Catherine of Siena or Julian Norwich, like reading Revelations of Divine Love and being like, maybe there's something more to this. Simone Weil is a very common one as well that you'll hear. And they encounter these thinkers and go, oh, maybe there's something more to this. And maybe there's a way of navigating Christian misogyny and not practicing Christianity in a misogynistic way. A lot of these people find me and they will ask me, hey, you seem like you know about Christianity. Can you talk to me? And then I'm like, sure. And then they're like, oh, wait, you're a man. That's happened 3 times.
Okay, to be
like,
fair, I don't think your PFP is pretty on Twitter is pretty. I'm not gonna say
it's
it's like
Simone Weil.
okay.
It's
That makes
Simone
sense
Weil,
then.
but like I like Simone Weil. Anyway, I
Just
do
like
have in my bio John from the Christianity on the Spectrum podcast, so I feel like they should at least read that part because that's probably not a
okay,
woman's name.
that's true. I will also say that the people that you've mentioned all have had, not all, but many of them have had, like Simone Weil and then Catherine of Siena and many of the medieval nuns and many mystics have, anorexia mirabilis is the term that's used. It is different from anorexia nervosa, but it is ascetic fasting for spiritual concerns, which a secular person would describe it perhaps as an eating disorder, but a person in a religious community or the saint themselves would describe in spiritual terms. I think this is something which attracts autistic women, especially because autistic women do have trouble with their own bodies,
Yes.
and eating disorders are very common in this demographic as well.
Yes, that is very true. And often how they start becoming interested in them. And they find a lot of relatability in these places. A lot of them also start having mental health concerns and are like, I feel like something is missing and I just need something else. And those concerns often lead to people investigating religion. And sometimes they find Christianity. And yeah, so the thing that usually brings them in to Christianity, surprisingly to some people, is Christian sexual ethics. They often read Christian sexual ethics. And like you said, maybe Paul was like an Andrea Dworkin of his time. When you said that, I laughed, but I have heard that sentiment expressed many times where they will look at the development of Christian sexual ethics and go, So one of the things that they'll point out is read the sexual vice lists that Paul lists. Whose sexual vices are they? Mostly men's sexual vices. Read Jesus' sexual ethics. Whose sexual vices is he talking about? He's talking about men's sexual vices. And there's a lot of very interesting things when you start reading about the development of Christian sexual ethics. A lot of it is developed to constrain male sexuality. At least that's how they read it. And that's how they interpret it, as the attempt to constrain like male sexuality and male sexual domination of the poor underclass in Roman society. In Roman society, their analysis is like, look, you have these two classes. You have an underclass and you have an overclass. The overclass is the virginal women who are protected by their fathers, who are kept pure by a transfer of male violence from this male upper class to the women of an underclass. And so if you look at like the Roman flesh trade, it was very strongly tied to having slaves and poor women forced into prostitution, basically and explicitly characterized as a vessel for male sexual violence to be expelled so they wouldn't touch the pure virginal innocent women. And Christianity comes in and is like, no, no channeling your sexual violence toward the underclass of women. Actually, no channeling your sexual violence at all. Your sexual violence is bad and you shouldn't do it. And there are hundreds of cases. So if you read most early Christian sexual ethics, it is ascetic in its teaching. It is like, no, actually stop. Don't indulge yourself. Don't like only do it a bit. Literally stop. This is killing you. This is bad for you. You are a fallen being screwing everything up. And there is an especial Christian concern for pederasty and anti-pederasty, which a lot of radfems go, oh, that's interesting that they looked at the institutions of prostitution and pederasty and went, these are sites of destruction of human souls. Like the first word for pederasty written by Christians isn't the terms that like Plato uses. The term literally is a portmanteau that means child corrupter. Like they specifically cite pederastic
Yeah.
sex, which was talked about in like glowing terms as this horrid corrupting influence, and they talk about it as being channeled through male sexual violence, and then they also apply that to things like prostitution.
Yeah, this
um,
is also something which, like, the anti-pederasty is something which is very, it comes from the early church reacting against sort of Greek ideas of homosexuality, which very much were based on pederasty, and then concerns about safety within the church. This is something which there were concerns about in the problems which, like, we think about the child sex abuse crisis within like the Catholic Church, or various, it's like the Southern Baptist like conference as well, like being, I think that's it, I think that's what it's called. I'm not as a Catholic, I'm not as quite familiar with non-Catholic Christianity. The we tend to think of that this is like a very modern evil. This is something which happened throughout the history of the church, and there were people within the church who were actively protesting this and writing about this as an evil, and that is, it's not a, like, it's a very old concern as well.
yeah, and there's also like a lot of developments within sexual ethics. So one example that I frequently cite is Saint Basil the Great. He's one of the Cappadocian fathers. He has this homily where he's talking about prostitution, and then in this homily he makes a distinction between people who voluntarily engage in prostitution, who have other means, and women who do not engage, who do not have other means and are forced into prostitution. And he talks about it as being coercive and not a choice, and that the women who have other choices and just want to engage in prostitution, they have sinned against God, and if they do not seek his forgiveness, will be damned. But he looks at this other class of women who are forced into prostitution by economic necessity and goes, though they have sexually sinned, God will have mercy on them and he will forgive them for doing these things. And he basically develops a primitive notion of consent in this, where he basically says, look, your active agency in this choice is actually relevant to determining whether you have sinned or whether you have been sinned against. And he specifically uses that. John Chrysostom himself talks a lot about these types of things as well, and he specifically uses terminology about men sinning against women, not necessarily the woman herself sinning. There are a lot of concerns with things like rape and sexual assault and things like that, and whether or not women are responsible for it. And the Christian answer is no. And this is something that, like, in an honor shame culture, is actually a really big deal that you're pushing against and saying, no, actually your honor is not violated because your honor is not tied to the shame of having something done to you. Your honor is tied to your salvation in Christ. And so long as these things are in place, it's no longer actually like a factor there.
Are you familiar with Maria Goretti?
Vaguely.
Maria Goretti was, I'm probably going to get the specifics of the story wrong, but she was a martyr from the early 20th century who
Oh
was
yes,
stabbed to
yes I
death,
am.
yeah, by a man who was trying to rape her. And this is I do think that the way Maria Goretti is spoken about and talked about is shows, I think, kind of the ways that kind of like Christians, like when we talk about like consent, I think it's a really interesting thing to look at. She was canonized by the Catholic Church. She died of the wounds that she sustained while fighting against her attacker. And so there are many kind of reasons that are given for her the canonization. One is that she forgave her rapist while she was dying. The other is that she like fought him off, and that this is, she wanted to just like so much remain pure. And I think that both of these things, like in some ways, can be really problematic for feminists in terms of the idea that one needs to risk death in order to like remain pure, and otherwise one can be like held liable for not living according to the Christian sexual ethic, and the other in which like you're a bad person if you don't forgive your rapist. And I think the way that Maria Gretti's story is spoken about tends, I think it can be spoken about in ways that are like actively harmful and actively very bad, especially for survivors of sexual assault. However, I do think that like the way that I could conceptualize this and deal with this is that Maria Goretti, in forgiving him, is doing something which is extraordinary. And she's really participating in Jesus's love, the way that Jesus forgave those who crucified him, the way that like Pope John Paul II forgave the man who like tried to kill him, assassinate him. So this is an extraordinary form of the ethic of forgiveness. This is not something which is like should be used in any way as a cudgel against like people who commit, as a cudgel against women who have been victimized or people who like or used to like swipe abuse under the rug. And then also the way of in choosing to fight off her attacker, this should not be used in any way as to like say that women who don't do this are consenting, but rather just that some women do fight off their attackers. This is what she chose to do, but it should not be used as a cudgel against survivors of sexual violence in any way. But I do think her story is very interesting for looking at the ways in which we view themes of like forgiveness and purity within the Christian teaching and faith.
Yeah, and that is like I have heard endless discussions on this topic specifically. Like as soon as you said early 20th century, I was like, oh yeah, nope, yeah, familiar. But I will often hear from the radfems who talk about her to say, look, this has not like been the church's consistent sexual ethic for its entirety. The church does not have a sexual ethic. Like it does not have a coherent sexual ethic where this is the way that we conceptualize things. It has many sexual ethics and you can live within those sexual ethics and you can be like, sure, you do have Maria Goretti's, but you also have other ways of conceptualizing sex and sexuality.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I would completely agree with that. I think that I completely agree with that. And I will say that like some sexual ethics are very problematic and some are not problematic or as problematic. There's a whole gamut here.
Yeah. And like a big thing that gets emphasized a lot is Christians identifying prostitution as a avenue of exploitation against women, and more specifically a financial exploitation against women. Very common in the early church. Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus, the guy who Santa Claus was based on, the gifts he was giving were gifts given to women so that they didn't have to engage in prostitution.
Yeah.
That those are the gifts he's giving them, and the work of the church being one that looks to avoid the sexual exploitation of women through financial exploitation is something that is very super common themes throughout church history, and one that you can find almost everywhere no matter where you look. Justinian who is a Byzantine emperor, has these sweeping anti-prostitution reforms, and when you look at his logic for it, the logic is because there are unscrupulous men sexually exploiting young women and taking advantage of them. And most of these women are not here voluntarily. And he has this one part where he goes in to check on how well his reforms are working, and he realizes they aren't working at all. So he passes even harder reforms to ensure that. And so it's easy to accuse Christians of going wrong in a lot of places. But one of the things that a lot of these women will point to is Christians actually got this right, and got this right pretty early on. Like the polemics against sexual exploitation is not one of the things that Christianity fumbled on in a lot of ways. Sure, there were people who fumbled it, like St. Augustine, I think, fumbled it really hard in the City of God.
City of God, there are parts of it which are so strange that when they are printed, parts of it are not printed in translation because it would frankly scandalize like the lay reader, which I find. So if you want to figure out Augustine's saying, you either have to know Latin or be able to like copy and paste it into your Google Translate. This is basically what I'm referring to is the part in City of God, which is like the prelapsarian or sexuality, which is I think some pretty strange ideas about what that would look like. Anyone who like conversant with like classical history, like if you look at what the remains of Pompeii and Herculaneum with the Mount Vesuvius that's been preserved, and there are many brothels that have been preserved. And on social media, this is sometimes viewed in a very lighthearted manner. in terms of like, oh, like these people were horny, etc. And there are many
Yeah.
like frescoes and things of like what of the activities that went on there. But this is frankly a site of an atrocity. These are women who
Yes.
were frequently bought. They were captured during Roman military expeditions. They were brought there not of their own accord. They were functionally sex slaves, and they had very short lives. And it was just a total, it's the site of a hideous war crime, and frankly, I do not think should be treated very lightly. So once you're understanding that this kind of horrific bondage, sexual bondage, was something that was forced upon many like women and children of the classical world, the Christian sexual ethic starts making a lot more sense.
Yeah, and there's there's a poem, the poem by Holly McNish. It's called Conversations with an Archaeologist. And this is based on a true story. And the poem goes like this. He said they'd found a brothel on the dig he did last night. I asked him how they know. He sighed. A pit of baby's bones, a pit of newborn's baby bones. That's how we spot a brothel. That's not a joke. That is actually how they do it. One of the
Yeah.
ways that they identify them is babies, large collections of babies' bones. Yeah, this is like it is hard to read about the climate of sexuality in the Roman world. People often go, "Oh, Christianity was so sexually repressive," and it's like if you lived back then, you would be like, you guys aren't going hard enough. Like, what is wrong with you? And a lot of it starts to make sense when you realize that the majority of Christian converts in the first few centuries were women. If you look at archaeological digs of churches, and they found a record of, during one of the Roman persecutions of the church, they found a record of a church that was raided, and they list the contents that they raided. And they found garments for men and garments for women. And it was something like 4-1 women to men in the church. And one of the earliest signs, or one of the earliest non-Christian witnesses to Christianity, is a letter from Pliny the Younger to Trajan, who talks about how he was investigating these Christians, and so he found 2 slave girls who were deacons in the church, and he tortured them for information. And like that's just what he's writing in a letter. And when you consider most of most of Christianity was being made up of the urban poor and like the urban working class, basically, and urban slaves and the slave class. Sexual exploitation was something on everyone's mind, and something that needed to be addressed. We don't know how like Paul addressed what to do if you were a slave girl and you were being raped by your master, which was a very common thing. It was so common it wasn't even considered like a crime or a bad thing. It was considered a normal thing to do. It was considered completely commonplace, and often like young boys, their first sexual experiences would be with their household slaves, and that was seen as a good normal thing because it wasn't on upper class women. And so when you look at Christianity coming into this mess and trying to sort it out, did they sort it out perfectly? No, but they certainly changed it. And
Yeah.
there's a reason that Christianity is the way that it is. There's a
The other
book.
thing
Oh, go ahead.
I would say quickly on this is that so one of the reasons why some of the Romans thought that some of the Christians were very strange is because the point I'm trying to make with this is that I think a lot of the sexism that you do get in Christianity, just to reiterate this point, doesn't really come from Christianity, the tenets of what Christ was really trying to bring to the world, or how we can like greater participate in being good Christians and participate in like the divinity of Christ through being a good Christian. This is something which is just very much that was the part of the culture of the time. So I remember when I was taking my like a Roman history class, we were just like studying this document in which the Romans were talking about how weird the Christians were, and one of the things they thought was very weird about the Christians in Egypt was they practiced female genital mutilation. FGM is not a Christian practice. However, it was practiced by these Christians at the time because that was something that was generally practiced in Egypt at the time. And so when you had Egyptian Christians, they basically did not update their practices to get rid of this until eventually like they did. But that so I'm basically saying is it is very difficult to disentangle. I think also when you're looking at history, like what is the Christianity, like what is the religion versus what is the cultural context as well that can be quite negative.
Yeah. And the question of what's a bug and what's a feature, a lot of the radfems will be like, the feature is sexual ethics. The bug is patriarchy
Yeah.
when you're looking at this. There's another guy who he wrote a book called The Weirdest People in the World about just what the West basically. His name is Joseph Henrik, and he has a line in the book where he says basically Christianity reached out and grabbed men by the testicles, talking about like the intended effect was sexual repression, and sexual repression from basically to prevent the sexual exploitation of the poor underclass. You have lots of other situations. One that also gets cited is Theodora, who is Justinian's wife and the empress. She was a former actress, apparently. Like, this is controversial, but anyway. And actresses were very closely tied with like sexual exploitation and the sex trade and the flesh trade in the Roman world. And she passed a lot of anti-prostitution reforms and specifically started a house called Metanoia, which was for the reforming of prostitutes to train them to do different work. And so a lot of them would be like, look, there is Christian technology in here to recognize exploitation and provide reform. Now, the mentions of metanoia are in a attack on Theodora and Justinian, and so it's framed as a bad thing that she did this. It's like in the secret histories. Anyway, Thecla is a common thing mentioned by a lot of autistic Christian women. Thecla was an early Christian saint. She baptized herself, and Paul treated it as valid. There was a cult devoted to Thecla that was apparently quite active. It was active enough that we have the diaries of a Christian woman from Spain, and she mentions specifically on her way through Anatolia, stopping by and going to the cult of Thecla or the shrine of Thecla. So that comes up a lot. The idea of sexual renunciation and becoming a virgin as a option for women was a sort of radical shift in Roman life, in Christianity, like the idea that you could no longer be under your father or under a husband or something, but a secret third thing, and that secret third thing was dedicated to the Lord. Is that perfect? No, absolutely not, but it's creating a category for women outside of sex and reproduction, which is something that a lot of radfems go, look, was it perfect? No, but it's a good start. And a lot of there's a lot of interest in the sort of traditions of sexual renunciation and things like that, especially for women, that radfems are very interested in. And so another big thing that comes up a lot is like a lot of the archaeological discoveries of women with communion bowls in their graves, and just other archaeological records. These are disputed of what their meanings are, but you'll also hear them talk about, look, Phoebe was the carrier of the letter to the Romans. It is Romans chapter 1, I commend to you, or chapter 16, verse 1, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon in the church of Cancrea. That's a female deacon that Paul is entrusting with the carrying of the letter. Letters weren't just carried, they were read, they were preached on. The person carrying the letter was there to give a sermon on it because most people couldn't read. And so she would be given the letter and preach it. So the letter of Romans was probably first preached on by a woman. Junia is also mentioned in the book of Romans, called foremost amongst the apostles. And it was so controversial that her name was Junia that the name was changed in other Bible translations later on. Yeah, so there's a lot of emphasis on women's role in the early church for these Christian radfems who were like, look, this is not an aberration. This is not a new thing. This is a thing that would have been intentionally suppressed by a dominant patriarchal culture. When Christianity became the norm and became the mainstream, it makes sense that the patriarchal culture would subsume this and crush this thing within Christianity. And so there's usually like a sort of return idea for return to the early church. Yeah, so there are lots of narratives and thoughts about how Christianity is more egalitarian. One of the most commonly cited Bible verses is Galatians 3:28, which is, in Christ there is no man, there is no woman, there is no slave, nor free, nor Greek, nor Jew. And that radfems get a lot of mileage out of that one. Yeah, of course, they also are pretty harsh critiquers of Christianity and Christian tradition. and very willing to acknowledge how much it's screwed up. But they're like, look, they're still Christians, and they still want to do something with this tradition, and they want to use it. And they're like, there is a better way to do this. There is a better way to practice this. We are already in one of those better ways. They got rid of slavery. We can get rid of gender-based oppression. This doesn't need to be a feature. It is something we can transcend, and it's something we can transcend that doesn't have to be like against what Christianity truly is or what it's truly meant to be. And that's where they cap it. Yeah, so it's very much Christianity got a lot wrong, but it did get some things right, and we should chase those things that they got it right, and we should follow along this trajectory, which they believe is a trajectory towards liberation. So yeah, that's basically what they look like. That's what this population is. I find them fascinating. I'm friends with many of them. I can, like I said, whenever I find a female version of me, they hold this belief. So I'm pretty sure had I been born a woman, I would have been right alongside them, fighting with them, fighting the good Christo Dorcanist fight. Yeah, so that's all I have. Do you any final thoughts? Anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that I do think that about covers it. I do think it is interesting that within Christianity, the many different strains of Christianity, you do see different theologies lends itself to different like radical feminist interpretations, which is an interesting thing as well. So I just wanted to, this is something we discussed before, which isn't necessarily, I don't think we touched on this, but I think that's fine. I think that your podcast on like trans issues and autistic Christian people is actually very good. And I think we might be going over like the same kind of ground, but just that like very like Calvinist doctrines versus Molinist doctrines or understandings of free will and sin have odd implications, or certainly have implications for how people understand like gender roles and what gender is. And they're basically all kinds of ways that like theologies that aren't necessarily social teachings have implications for gender roles and gender, which can actually get pretty like interesting and strange and odd, and something which I intellectually like really enjoy thinking about. And that's something that I think that maybe we haven't touched on so much, but I'm just in general that there are certain theologies which maybe don't have a lot to do with social teaching, but do have many like, I wouldn't say that I would like they've like I would identify them explicitly as autistic people, but like the people who like thinking about like the implications of like gender and Christianity and how this manifests is actually interesting too.
Yeah, and I should say just on the previous episodes, most autistic Christian radfems that I meet are not trans inclusive, to put it mildly. So this is complicated though. This does get very complicated because there are many who would call themselves trans inclusive who I don't think would be considered trans inclusive by other trans people, but some that would be. This gets into very complicated ground and very complicated territory, and it
Yeah.
mostly has to do with like gender ontology and what you actually think gender is. So if you think it's a fixed thing from birth and there's nothing you can do about it, there are still people like that who call themselves trans inclusive, who see trans inclusion as like an accommodation for weird people, which is not something that trans people would appreciate very much. And
Yeah, more
other
the
ones,
Calvinist interpretation.
yes, yes. And then there are like other interpretations that are more like, actually none of this, like no gender is real, and so if no gender is real, then trans identity is fine. However, there are limits to how fine it is depending on the context that you're in and the stage of transition that you're in. And you don't just automatic no self ID, but yes to transition. And after a certain point in time, then you will be mostly accepted as a woman, maybe not on some cases. It gets very complicated. A lot of them don't
Yeah.
want, like a lot of them aren't raging turfs. Like they aren't like in your
No.
face, I hate trans people, I
Uh,
want them eliminated. They're more like, I just think there are some practical issues that we need to be cognizant of, which would
yeah.
not put them in the trans inclusive camp for most people.
Yeah, I would say that I consider myself to be a trans-inclusive radical feminist, and I have trans friends who would agree with that, but I also know trans people who would very radically disagree with what my sort of ontology of gender, and would view my ontology of gender as like actively like destabilizing or at odds with their conception of gender. So again, as you say, like these things can be very complicated, and just people have like lots and lots of different people have very many different conceptions of gender just in general. And yeah, I do think that this is more just to bring up rather than to advocate for any kind of certain view, just beyond to advocate, definitely advocating for respect and viewing everyone, no matter what their gender or gender orientation or like presentation or sexual orientation or presentation, as first and foremost as a child of God. But to really to not to advocate a certain point. I didn't bring this up to advocate a certain point of view, but rather just to say that there are like interesting intersections of like theology and gender, and how Christians conceive of gender roles, as well as how radical feminists also conceive of gender beyond the kind of, oh, we need to get rid of this as much as possible.
Yeah, there it gets very complicated. If you would like more of a deep dive into trans inclusion versus trans exclusion, there's an episode on that. Check that out. It is, yeah, it can be a wild ride. It can be very weird where, again, yeah, you'll have some people who are like, I'm trans inclusive. And then you ask them like what their positions are on various hot button issues. And they're like fully aligned with the trans exclusive side. And then I'm like, what do you mean by you're trans inclusive? I think we should be nice to them. Okay. I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that might not be as inclusive as you think it might be. But with Christianity, I would say the majority that I talk to are not trans inclusive. And unless they are themselves trans, I have talked to a few trans women who are radical feminists who are like loved Dworkin. I know one who's a Dworkin scholar. And so like
Oh,
these
awesome. That's so cool.
yeah, these do exist. Andrew Dworkin herself was trans inclusive. Catherine McKinnon is
Yes,
trans
as is Catherine
inclusive.
McKinnon.
Yeah, and so not under an obligation to be. It's just that Christianity tends to add some gas to the fire of pushing you to one side or the other.
Yeah, in general, I do think that trans inclusionary radical feminism is more coherent in terms of saying that just understanding the way the mechanisms that like sort of sexism and gender oppression kind of work also affect trans, for example, like really do affect trans women in very similar ways. This is something that Catherine McKinnon has pointed out, as well as the idea that like by enforcing gender conformity, which is a trans exclusionary more view, you're actually reifying gender, and you're making gender, you are contributing to like making gender like real in terms of and mattering in a sociocultural context. When as personally the radical feminist, I think that's the opposite of what one should be doing. That's the case that I think that the case for radical feminism that trans inclusive people would make. Yes, I would recognize that what you say in terms of the practicalities, there are lots and lots of disagreements, and yeah, let's just say that radical feminists are very much divided on the issue.
And there are even disagreements within the trans radical feminists as well, on these issues as well. Anyway, lots of distinctions, lots of differences. If you would like to learn more about them, you can go listen to that episode. We're already like 2 hours or getting close to it.
Oh yeah.
I think we can cap it here. Would you like to plug anything or let the people of this podcast know where to find you, or should we just let that float into the ether and they can find you if they want?
Oh, I'm on Twitter as the Overthinking Hedonist.
You can find me at christianityon.bluesky.social. You can find me on Twitter at christianityon. You can find me by email, christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. You can also join our Discord. You can send me emails. You can do whatever. You can listen to this podcast. You can like, comment, subscribe on whatever platform you listen to. It helps the podcast. You can also donate to the Against Malaria Foundation. This podcast is running a thing for that. Yeah, that's all. Okay, we'll end it here.